Betsaida excavations. And I want to tell you that, at least my personal feeling, that it was a very successful 2 days, and we heard we had 2 days of absolutely top presentations, the best that we can ever have. And what everybody is also telling me, that it's not only the presentations which are so good, it's also the atmosphere that you all managed to create, and you all welcome in such a great way the presenters, and you all feel at home with you, and they feel good, and there is absolutely no tension and no anything which would jeopardize the good feeling and the success of the conference. So before I begin, I want to thank you very much for coming for these 2 days. We had a wonderful 2 days, and as soon as this is going to be over, we'll have to sit down and to start working for the next year, the 26th season, and the presentations in the conference of next year. So, in my presentation today, in the afternoon, I'm going to try to put Betsaida in a larger framework, and I'm not so sure that what I'm doing complies exactly to your BB archaeology that we do, because now after what your presentation, Hala, I'm kind of intimidated with presenting interpretations, because I don't know where it may go. But I will try to put Betsaida in a very large picture of the coming of the Arameans, and try to portray the culture of the Arameans in the southern Levant, and to see how what not only Betsaida excavation teaches us about it, but also other excavations in the region that were conducted on Geshurite sites. What all of us together, all these excavations together, what did they put up, what did they present, and this is kind of an interwined spread presentation. Now, the Arameans who made a population of Betsaida, and this is another interpretation, it's not written anywhere, and we base this assumption on the fact that the very few inscriptions that we have from Betsaida and from other sites which are in the region were written in Aramaic and not in Hebrew. So if it is Aramaic, it's Aramean people, and it's not Hebrew, and it's not Israelite. This is the assumption that we made. We built it up, and based on these 2 inscriptions, to identify this unique culture with the Arameans. The other reason is that it is different from the Israelites in their material culture. So we have difference in the material culture from the Israelite. We have a language which is Aramaic, so we try to put one and one together and say this unique culture is Aramaic, or Aramaic culture, because we have this database, and I think I'm kind of on the safe ground by saying it. So let me tell you a little bit about who these Arameans were and where did they come from, and how they ended up in the region of Betsaida, which is in the Golan, north part of the Sea of Galilee. All right, so the Arameans showed up for the very first time in the 14th century BC in northern Syria, in a place called Jabal Bishri, which is mountain or northeast Syria, which is not far away from the Euphrates River. So this is kind of close to the Euphrates River. This is where the Arameans show up in history for the very first time. And they are mentioned for the very first time as a people by the name of Achlamu, which slightly later on they would be changing to Arameans. And the very first thing we know about them when they rise up to history is that the Assyrians defeated them, destroyed them all, and they disappeared. This is what we know from the Assyrian documents dating from the 14th century BC. And you can imagine how reliable this, and we are talking about reliability of texts. So this is the reliability of the Assyrian text, which they claim have destroyed them all. Actually, they will not destroy them. On the contrary, they will destroy the Mesopotamian culture, which we developed later on. So this is the very first appearance, and which means that they are kind of nomads. And that reminds us, and this is very interesting, and we don't know exactly what's the connection and correlation, but exactly the same phenomenon happened 1,000 years earlier with another group of people called Amorite in the Bible, or Amuru by the Akkadian documents, who appeared exactly at the same place, from the same place, Jabal Bishri, at 1,000 years earlier, and expanded all over the Middle East. And finally, not finally, but during their expansion to the east, to the southeast, they conquered Babylon and settled Babylon and became in fact an Amur or Amorite culture. And perhaps I'm sure that you know the most famous king, King Hammurabi, who said without a shame that I am an Amorite, which means I am a Moro, which means I'm kind of my origin is quite humble. I'm coming from this North Syria mountain range of Jabal Bishri. So this is 1,000 years earlier, 1,000 years later in the 14th century BC, we see these Arameans, kind of similar situation, and they expand to both areas, to Babylon on one hand side, and they go all the way down to southern Levant on the other hand side, and they settle the entire Syria from north, from let's say southern Turkey today, all the way down to Bethsaida, establishing small kingdoms all over these places. We know about at least 3 or 4 of them from the Bible, but there were many, many more of them that the Bible doesn't mention. We know from the Bible the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, we know the one which is in Levo, farther north, in Hama, another farther north, and we know of some others all the way up to Cilicia, to the very northern part of the Aramean sphere. So that is north-south, and then expanding alongside the Euphrates River all the way to the Persian Gulf, in fact. So we're going to deal with only one group of these Arameans, the Arameans that settled in the Golan, which is the southernmost part of the Aramean expansion. They couldn't go farther south because in the south of the Golan is the Gilead, and that was inhabited by the Israelites. And farther south of this were the Ammonite and Moabite and so on. They couldn't go to the Galilee, which is again was populated by Israelites, and farther to the west, where the Phoenicians were very powerful, strong states, and they wouldn't absorb or let the Arameans come and settle in their places easily. So that is actually the southernmost place that they could penetrate in this way long. So we go to see the area here where they settled, where was the southernmost part of their settlement. So this is the Golan area, and as I have it written down here, the Golan is an inclined basalt plateau rising to the northwest about here to about 1,000 meters, 3,000 feet above the sea level, and dropping to the southwest here to an elevation of 200 meters, which is 600 feet below the sea level. The Golan is defined by very obvious border. Sorry. At the north, there is the plateau borders with the massive limestone mountain of the Hermon Mountain, which is the southernmost extension of the entire Lebanon range. So we see two ranges that go all the way north. There is where we are. At the south, the Golan is bordered by, we don't see it here in the map, but it's going to be about like here. It's going to be bordered by a deep gorge of the Yarmouk River, separating the basalt Golan from the limestone Gilead. A deep and short gorge of Wadi Allah, we don't see it here, but it's found to the east, marks the eastern borders of the Golan, and the Jordan River marks its, here this is the Jordan River, marks its western boundary. Heavy rainfall, rugged terrain, and coverage of Tabor oak forest features the northern Golan. This landscape changes gradually towards the central Golan here, and to the south where the rugged terrain gives way to rich agricultural soils. You can see here in this area, this situation is true today, and was true also in the past. At the edges towards the Jordan River, as we can see it here in the picture, the Sea of Galilee and the Yarmouk, the plateau is bisected by short gorges and deep canyons called masils that you see all over around here, and they are these masils. As can be imagined, the fertile areas of central and southern Golan were from time immemorial more hospitable to human habitation than the Rocky North. A few important branches of the international trade routes emerge from Damascus, which is about here. You see about where it goes, and pass through the Golan and Bashan, the famous King's Highway. This is it here. This is the Via Traiana Nova that will become later on, that goes right on the same route, the Via Traiana Nova. But perhaps also this is the route of Hadrian and the route of other kings that would come along through this road, and connect Damascus with the Red Sea, passes through the Bashan and the Haoran, bordering the Golan. So here, this is the road that we are talking about. Few branches of the road leading to Egypt through Hatzor, and this we've seen in Richard's presentation. Here we are talking about this one here. Megiddo, and along the seashore, across the upper Jordan River through fords known as the daughters of Jacob, bridge all through the ford next to Bethsaida, about here, or descending to the east, as you can see here, to the eastern shores of the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River. A branch that takes off from the King's Highway, descends through the Yarmouk Valley to the Jordan Valley, most probably through this route. This route, the Arameans first settled on the Golan Plateau. Sometimes during the 12th, 11th centuries, we see in the wake of the Egyptians withdrawal. So we have to picture in our mind the Egyptians moving out, and the Arameans are just on their wake, taking their place, and using exactly the same routes and going to all these places. And this is the way they, in fact, they came in. They mingled with the local population, the descendants of the runaway citizens of the Canaanite towns of the late Bronze Age, and the descendants of the Hurrian immigrant population that remained in this area. Earlier on in the 16th century, about in the same route, the Hurrians came in, who fled from their destroyed empire in the upper Euphrates River, and some of them arrived to this area in this period of time. Unlike the Hurrian predecessors, who came as individuals, made use of their skills as charioteers, integrated in the upper echelon, and served as warriors and mercenaries, the Arameans most probably migrated in large numbers and filled up all the ranks of the society. They were pastoralist, agrarian, merchants, and guardians of the trade routes. So we see difference in, as I suggest, between the Hurrian penetration about a few centuries earlier to the Arameans, who would be more like migration and a large migration of people, something which they would come with the entire families down there to Golan. Their presence was overwhelming, and in the few generations they made Aramaic prevalent language of the region. This fact is testified by few inscriptions preserved from the Iron Age and the Golan, all of which were written in Aramaic. Unlike the Israelites, who settled few places, the Arameans preferred to revive all places. The Israelites preferred to settle new places, but that was not a rule. They would settle also old places that they saw, but they preferred new places to settle. The Arameans, unlike the Israelites, preferred to revive old places that were semi-deserted or totally abandoned. This was very clearly attested in the archaeological scrutiny of all Bronze Age sites that were resettled during the early Iron Age period. I'm talking about the 12th century BC. The archaeological team surveying the Golan Heights since 1968 reported on a meaningful rise in density of the Iron Age sites in the Golan from 15 sites during the late Bronze Age. This is the dates, 1550 to 1200 BC, to 52 sites during the Iron Age. So we see all of a sudden the influx of people coming in, and 3 times the number of sites in fact rise from 15 to 52. That is a considerable rise, 3 times as it used to be the centuries earlier. While northern Golan sites were mostly small and sometimes included secondary dorming tombs specifying 2 nominal population, most of the larger sites that were revived and resettled during the 12th 11th century BC were at the southern part of the Golan and were located along the various branches of the trade routes leading to the King's Highway or along the roads leading to Damascus. You see a very clear pattern alongside the main roads. This is the pattern of settlement in the Golan. Some sites contain forts and storage structures most probably associated with commerce and trade. Only a few late Bronze Iron Age sites were excavated to suggest a pattern of a transition of power from local inhabitants to Aramean. Since no layer of ashes and destruction were observed in the archaeology of these sites, it is apparent that the transition passes without a trauma. Which means a slow and peaceful infiltration that lasted perhaps all through the 12th and the 11th century. We see this slow infiltration, peaceful infiltration of these Arameans during this period of time, and all of a sudden we see that the number of settlements is being 3 times as large. This is also different from the Israelite settlement pattern, which is testified by layers of violent destruction, such as was discovered in Hatzor and other sites. So we see different settlement pattern during the Iron Age, during the first part of Iron Age 1. A good representation of a site from this period is a small and a round, but very important round-shaped mound of Tel Hadar, 2 hectares, half an acre. Oh no, sorry, not half an acre. 2 hectares is 10 acres. Is that so? Yeah. On the northeastern shores of the Sea of Galilee, a few miles southeast of Bethsaida, and was excavated by Moshe Kochavi and his Tel Aviv University team. The site was first settled during the mid-second millennium BCE, perhaps as a small fort protecting the trade routes passing in this area. 2 concentric walls surround a hilltop on which a round tower has been parked. The inner wall, I'm surprised I don't have the drawing. The inner wall was about 25 meters wide, and the outer was about 4.5 meters wide, and was built at a distance of 20 meters away from the inner city wall. Only small segments of this town were excavated, among which was the elongated row, perhaps a part of a tower. Fortification, however, are rather rare during this period of time. In southern Levant, this period marks the establishment of the Egyptian province in Canaan, and the Egyptian permitted fortification only for their garrisons controlling the trade routes. That may explain the abandonment of the site a short time after its construction. Kochavi suggested that this town, or one similar to it, might have been among the 7 Geshurite cities mentioned in the Amarna letter. However, during the Amarna period, 14th century BC, the excavators reported that the site was deserted. During the mid-second millennium BCE, the site was abandoned and remained vacant for a few centuries. However, a poor settlement was resumed during the 12th century BC. The inhabitants made use of the old fortification walls and built within it pit granaries. This is, by the way, very typical. We saw in Hebron very similar picture of pits and pit granaries that was typical to this period of time, almost everywhere, including Hazor, and including also the Golan High. Undoubtedly connected with the storage of a small quantity of grain produced in the region. No layer of ashes and destructions were reported separating this level of occupation from the next Aramean occupation, which means, as mentioned above, that the Arameans infiltrated slowly and peacefully into the area that was already semi-deserted. I don't see my drawings and pictures on this side, and I wonder where they are. I don't even see what happened to them. That was supposed to be all with pictures. Oh, yeah, that's right. Everyone, pictures were gone. All right. That's not good.
Looks like it's too
Okay. No, they're all gone. You know what I'm going to do? That's not good. Let's see. I really want to show you the pictures. And so now that's even worse. All right, so I think that what I'm going to do, if you don't mind, give me about like 2 minutes to set up my computer here and you work with us, okay? Without, all right, you're going to see everything a little yellow. I don't know why. Carl, you have any idea why it's yellow? No idea why, but you're going to see everything a little yellow.
It needs to be pushed in closer.
Low hilltop, on which the tower has been, you see the round tower, has been built. And you see the inner wall was 2.5 meters wide, and the outer was 4.5 meter wide. And it was, the distance was about 20 meters from each other. And only segments of this were excavated. The fortification, as I repeat this, and Kochavi interpreted is one of the El Amarna, and we covered this thing of, and here we go to the next one. You see it okay? Is that, do you mind? You see a little yellow? All right. Following the arrival of the Arameans, Tel Hadar was resettled, and this time it was built massively and on a grand scale. A spacious building that contains storage house and a granary was constructed in the inner circle adjacent to the inner wall. The storage house is a tripartite building in which the inner space was divided by single store columns or by superimposed drums. At the back of the inner, at the back of the building, two rooms were set apart from the storage, perhaps for special purpose. The central hall had a beaten earth floor, but the cobblestones covered the floor of the other two buildings. An opening in their mutual wall led from the storage to the granary. The latter contained 6 square shaped cells, each measuring 3.5 by 3.5 meters and connected by elevated threshold about 0.5 meters above the ground. The floor of the granary was paved, and the walls were and the floors were plastered. Although rare in architecture of southern Levant, Kochavi notes that this concept is known from Upper Euphrates River, the Jazeera, from the Habor Valley, and from the Urartian palace fortresses, as well as from Sudan and South Egypt. Undoubtedly, this is an Aramaic import. The entire capacity of the granary is about 150 metric tons of grain, which could have been produced of about 35 cultivated hectares. Kochavi suggested that it is a yield of fields located on the Golan Plateau. This structure could have been the forerunner of Chambers City Gate, is perhaps among the earliest of its type and indicates that the structure is Aramean concept. Another house that was interpreted as being used for storage was built east of the storage house. It was also a tripartite building separated by solid wall. One room contained jars arranged in rows, and the other rooms there were objects such as vessels and basins interpreted as utensils connected with the storing and processing of grain. The high capacity of commodities that the storage could have stored is due not only to the administrative skills of the rulers, but also probably to the improvements in agricultural tools of this time. Iron was introduced during this period of time, and iron plow tips were among the very first things that were manufactured. The fact that our modern plows are still made of iron means that this strong and new type of plows revolutionized agriculture in a real and unprecedented manner. It provides deeper and better plows, which resulted in high yields of grain surpluses in larger storage facilities. The main storage house at Tel Hadar contained dozens of storage jars, most probably for liquids such as oil and wine. Most of the jars are egg-shaped and jars with 3 handles pulled from the rim. These types are alien to the pottery repertoire produced by the Israelites and perhaps serve as ethnical marker for the Arameans in this region. In addition to this, Kochavi discovered a small clay model of the temple and a proto-geometric bowl originated from the peninsula of Euboea in Greece, testifying to long-distance commerce already during this period of time. This latter vessel seems to create a nature difficulty in dating system of pottery in southern Levant. The bowl dates in Greece from the 10th century BCE, yet Kochavi dates the destruction of Tel Hadar a century earlier. However, The chronology of the proto-geometric vessels of Greece is fluid and is primarily established on stylistic ground and not on stratified excavations. Kochavi therefore suggests to review the chronology of proto-geometric pottery, which is an interesting challenge. The excavator defined Tel Hadar in this period as an administrative, political center that collected taxes and grain from a vast area and distributed it via caravan roads leading from the Bashan to the west. The storage house and the granary testified indeed to a vivid commerce and administrative control. However, a palace is needed to be found in order to determine that this administrative center was also a political center and not only a storage town. The occupation of Tel Hadar ended in extremely violent action. A fierce conflagration consumed the entire site, destroyed the structures, and melted the bricks into clinkers. This process requires a heat of at least 1200 centigrade. Some pottery vessels were welded into the debris as a result of the heat that the granary was loaded with wheat at the time of the fire, which was carbonized and preserved. The excavators date this destruction to the end of the 11th century BC. Who was responsible for it? Kochavi thinks that this was the job of King Saul. The Bible does not record an explicit campaign of King Saul with the Arameans of Geshur, but a verse in 2 Samuel 2:8-9 defines the territory of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, which is said to contain the Gilead, the Ashurite, Jezreel, Ephraim, and Benjamin, and all Israel. Some scholars suggested reading Geshurite instead of Ashurite, or rather Asherite, as proposed by some other scholars. This version is supported by the Latin and Syriac translation of the Bible. Accordingly, the conflict between the Arameans and the Israelites that took place during the 9th century and the 8th century was a century older and may have started already in the 11th century. Kochavi also provided archaeological evidence for the presence of the Israelites in this area. His team of archaeologists conducted a dig at the place called Tel Sorek, situated in a deep valley that descended from the thick on the Golan Plateau to the Sea of Galilee. Here they discovered a type of a jar much discussed in archaeological research called the Kola ring jar. Scholars regard this type of jar as an ethnic marker of Israelite presence, and since it was discovered in small settlements in the central hill country of Israel, associated with Israelite settlement, the existence of this jar in a place remote from the Israelite sites may indicate connection with Israelites either by trade or commerce or actual Israelite presence in the Golan. However, the conqueror did not leave a calling card, and there could have been more than one contenders responsible for the destruction of Tel Hadar. Firstly, it could have been an internal strife based on social tension. The existence of controlled granaries and food supply in one place and hungry people in the other could easily trigger such a result. Secondly, it could have been other enemies playing a part in this theater, not necessarily the Israelite. Other players, and I did not necessarily could be the Egyptians. So we have seen these cities in everywhere, and we are now going to go into Tel Hadar, which is located in 5 start right here, you see, and this is Bethsaida. And Tel Hadar is now destroyed, and Bethsaida rises at the time when Tel Hadar destroyed. So we have up and down, and Bethsaida. I think that we have seen these slides before. Did you? I think that most of us saw the slides in my presentations before about Bethsaida, and I will only point out a couple of things that were there. For instance, so we have the very first inhabitants of Bethsaida buried under the city wall, and here we have the skeleton right here next to a bronze bowl and next to a jar, and the whole thing dates from the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, or about 12th century BC, the emergence of the Canaanites. And here we have a tablet that dates from this period of time that was found within this tomb. And this is also one of our most interesting, we saw it yesterday, one of our most interesting discoveries, also from this period of time. A couple laying buried in a tomb, a male and female, and here this is female, this is the male, and he is about the head above the female, and she is lying, and they both are lying in kind of a spooning position in which he has his arms around her.
And what do you date this to?
What is what?
The date, what's the date?
12th century.
12th century.
Yeah. All right, we have seen Bethsaida. This is the hill opposite Bethsaida, and Bethsaida perhaps started out like this sometime in the 12th to 11th to 10th century BC. But in the 10th century BC, they decided to elevate it into the state of a capital city. So we see the Arameans actually building up a kingdom after a very long start, which would take all the 12th and 11th centuries. In the 10th century, they are prosperous enough and strong enough to build up their capital city, and they do it in a very extraordinary way. Actually, I don't know if it's extraordinary, perhaps it's typical to its time, but they do it in a way that indicates that the whole project of building up the capital city was pre-planned, which means Bethsaida was not developed from a village to a small town, to a bigger town, to a fortified town, but not like this. It was built from Square A as a capital city, which makes us believe that there was a team of architects and engineers and all kind of other people who were engaged in putting a blueprint to the city and then build it accordingly. How do we know that? We have lines of terraces that build up the city. One is here, and the other one is here, and we have another line of terraces running this way, and we have the city wall and another city wall, and then we have the road, and we have pavement on the road, and we have a tower and a palace, and everything comes up at the same time. So all this indicates that we are dealing, in fact, with pre-planned city and not something that grew from village to a town. Here we have the city again, and the road leading to Bethsaida. I think that I have shown you these pictures already some time ago, and we go rather quick to see some of the elements we see. So these pictures a couple of times. And of course, also this, the lower city, the upper city, and the tomography that we did. And perhaps we go now to the 10th century BC and see what we have there discovered. And what we see here is the city wall here. And we have next to the city wall, we have the palace on the right-hand side. And next to the palace, where is it? This is the palace. This is the city wall. The gate is apparently now here, and we have a granary. So this is granary, of which only two cells were found, but they are twice as much as Tel Hadar, which means people or the authorities managed now to collect much more grain than they did a century earlier, which shows to a constant growth of population and grain and taxes in this period of time. I want to point out the three things that indicates that we are dealing with a kingdom, and this is a palace here, city wall, and granary, which means tax collection and distribution of taxes, defense, and a ruler. This is the three things that are needed for concluding that in the 10th century BC, we are dealing with a kingdom that has law and order, that collects taxes, and have also a ruler that runs the whole business. So here we have, it's not, all right, here we have remains of these things. You see all the remains of the floor that dates from the 10th century, and we have also the benches and pottery from this floor, and we have also the layers that are on top of it and date from the 10th century, and all the layers that dates to the later period of time. So we have a few more remains of this 10th century, like this corner of the tower of the city gate, and we have shards that dates from this period of time, and even earlier. What is one of our most amazing thing is this aphorism with inscription on the other side, which we did not decipher yet. I think this is something to do with proto-syllabic or Cypro-syllabic. This amphora came from the island of Cyprus. We have probes, and we have the seats of the elders of the city, and we remember them sitting down there and contemplating about life while their wives are running about. In the 9th century in Bethsaida and the region, we see a visitor coming in. Not very welcome visitor, the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser III, who leaves destruction in every one he went to. And in the year 841, he most probably passes through Bethsaida. It could be, I mean, we have two campaigns, one 841, the other one 848. It could be, but the most interesting thing that he says, in a very mutilated stele, that he encountered a king by the name of Baal, who is the king of the country of, we are missing the name, we are only making R at the end, which we obviously reconstructed as Geshur. Geshur Geshur probably became a vassal kingdom in the Arabian kingdom of Damascus during the reign of Hazael in the second half of the 9th century, if not earlier, and we see the city thriving. What is interesting about this is that despite the conquest and the annexation, on the contrary, perhaps contrary to what we would expect, the city thrived and became even stronger, larger, and the city gate was built in much larger scale. Here we have the city gate, all kind of sections, and if we compare the city gate of Bethsaida to our city gates that we know, you see that Bethsaida is the largest of all city gates ever found. Larger than Dan, Megiddo, Dor, Beersheba, Ashdod, Nasbeh near Jerusalem is very, very small compared to Bethsaida. It's about like third in size or something like this. You just name it, Bethsaida is larger. And here is the city wall destroyed. You see here it is, the outer city wall destroyed, and we see debris over the floor. Here's debris, and this after we have taken debris out. And the city gate, which you can see here, is a beautiful model that Dwayne prepared for us. This we have shown you already yesterday, and the reenactment, which is our thing that we like to do. Here is another object, very interesting one, that we found. You see a figurine of what we interpret as a bull, but what is interesting in this bull is the very similar symbol that we had in the moon god stela, right here, this round thing with an X mark on it or plus mark on it. And this is, I researching it now, and I suggest that it could have been something to a vessel that was supposed to anoint all kind of officers. So this is the bull that we found. And we have the direct access high place. We have 5 high places, the sacrificial high place. And we have the destruction made by Tiglath-Pileser III with all the vessels and like all these hippo jars that we had, cooking pot, and the vessel with the inscription to the name of the moon god. And you see that here. And we have a huge vat that we found in the storage house, and the palace next to it, and the siege of Bethsaida with the remains of the siege. And you see the model in work, and the conquest of Tiglath-Pileser III. This I like very much.
Can we see that again?
All right. So, and that is all for today. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions for Rami before he goes? If not, yes.
Why would this storage granary be full of grain? Why wouldn't they take the grain out and then bring the city or take the value of the grain would have been valuable?
Can you repeat?
Yeah, it was barley partly. We had the ware, in fact, the ware. Yeah, the question is why didn't they take the barley away? This is again one of the things that we had discussed it with in the presentation of Dr. Kim. And in order to answer this question, I actually have to go into the mind of the Assyrians and asking them. I didn't have the chance to interview the Assyrians to ask them, why didn't you take this? Why did you leave that? I don't know. Now, so this is one thing that you should know about archaeologists. All archaeologists everywhere. We are very good in answering questions that begin with the word how. We are very bad in answering questions that begin with the word why. Because the answering questions that begin the word why, you have to go to either historians or more probably to sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists. In some cases, even you may go to psychiatrists to ask the question why this person is behaving the way he does. Maybe this is a mental disorder or something. So but we are much better in telling you how things were done. So we can tell you how and what actually was left. Why did they take it away? You had to ask them. I'm the wrong person.
This might be halfway between how and why, but we're here in the middle of grain country, and everybody knows that if you store grain in something like a silo, and somebody throws a flame in there, you've got an explosive situation. So it may be that in taking down the gates, they set off the grain at the same time. It may not have been just they're burning it down to burning it down. It might have gone itself.
Could be. We have, according to now these BB archaeology, everything is possible.
They just left it there so we could date it. That's really what it comes down to. Yes.
Have you made different views of how it would look during different time periods?
How, what?
I mean, this construction is the oldest that we can imagine, right? You have
Yes, yeah.
dug down to the very bottom of everything.
Yes.
But if we're talking about the Roman period,
Yeah.
how were the houses? What did it look like at that period? Have you tried to make any reconstruction and
Of the
graphic?
Roman period, yes. We know
graphically-
something, yes, of course. Yeah, we know about how the Roman period looked like because that was the upper. I mean, we don't
Yes.
know about everything, only about the areas that we excavated. This is the upper part, and we know what was there. We know about the Philip wall, city wall that surrounded the city, and we know that part of the city wall of the Iron Age was still existing, but perhaps not to the very top, so the Philip built on top of it another wall. We know these things, yes.
But no, we haven't, no one's made a reconstruction of it.
No,
like this
because when you see the graphics, it looks like a mixture of everything,
Well,
of different time periods and different colors. But it would be interesting to see.
One color. Yeah, we
No,
do that,
well,
so-
a 3D like that
Now,
from the
the
Roman
thing is
period.
that when you see different colors, but I'm telling you, this is all starting 6 or 7 or 5 particularly, I mean, some of the segments were built earlier and lasted longer, so you have to put
Yes.
them in the same color. Yeah.
I think she was asking that, or saying that we need the Roman section there, that we could add on to that. And,
Yeah,
as
maybe,
the city grows.
Next
The
project.
next 25 years.
Next project, yes.
Rami,
Yes, Richard.
we spent a lot of time with the architecture of the Geshur city, 10th century,
Yeah.
9th century. The Roman buildings during 2,000 years ago, but their structure would be resemble the buildings we see at Quatrim.
At Katrin, no, Katrin is a little later, is Byzantine. And in Katrin, they had perhaps more money, or in one way or other, they dressed the stones. While in the Roman period, Bethsaida, dressed stones are only at the temple. They did not dress any other stones. I mean, all the others just 3 stones. But in the later period, in this region, in Katrin or others, most of the houses were made of dressed stones, which we can presume much of it was stolen from earlier periods.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I have one question regarding the palace and David. Normally, David is today in the research dated at the beginning of the 10th century. It's the first half of the 10th century. And our palace, too, it's the second part of the 10th century. Then it was David, that would mean David lived long before, sometime long before the palace was built. So
correct. This is if you take the biblical chronology
Yeah.
as it is. But who said that David reigned for 40 years and Solomon reigned for 40 years? Maybe the Solomon reigned 40 years in the Bible. We go now to biblical research. 40 years in the Bible is just a large number. It doesn't mean that it was 40 years. One thing we know is that in 930 BC, that was year now 1 of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. But we are not so sure that 40 years of his father, Solomon, would bring us to 970. Maybe it was only 10 years. Maybe David and Solomon together were no more than 15 years. And then you are in Saddam City. I don't know. Maybe yes.
Yeah.
Maybe you're right. And they were. Indeed, it goes to the first half of the 10th century.
So that's
But
normally
the
the
only
dating.
thing, yeah, it all depends on how
Yeah.
you value the 40 years of David and Solomon, which appear in the Bible.
Okay, how do
which
you
I
date-
don't think they were 40
Okay,
years.
how do you date the palace? Our palace?
950 BC to 730.
950 about.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the middle.
Now, you are right. If David goes to the first half,
Then David
but
did.
if David goes to the first half, you have to believe that Solomon was indeed 40 years.
Uh-huh.
But
Yeah, okay.
40 years is a round number for a large number in the Bible, and I don't necessarily have to buy it.
Thank you for your questions, and
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. you.
Yes,
And please come again and visit us at Bethsaida in June and take part in the annual dig. And come again next year when we are going to have our next Bach Schroeder Conference for Biblical Archaeology. Thank you very much.